Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism. In particular, I had you read this week a primary text, Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism, which is actually a speech that he gave in order to explain the nature of his philosophy. This is more suitable for our purposes than Sartre's something like 800-page long book, Being in Nothingness, where he elaborates on all this stuff in depth. In these lectures, Sartre hopes to give a sort of popular introduction to his philosophy and to explain what he sees as the moral or ethical importance of existentialist philosophy. Now, I should say, actually, before we get started, that usually in discussions of ethics, there are what are referred to as the big three ethical theories. And by that, they mean the three ethical theories that we have discussed up to this point: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. These are sort of the major philosophical frameworks that most working ethicists today use in order to evaluate moral dilemmas and to sharpen their own moral reasoning. However, as should be completely clear by the nature of ethics, of course, it is entirely possible to have a whole number of approaches and ideas that factor into our ethical decision-making that do not clearly or cleanly fit within any of the three theories that we have discussed. Existentialism is a case like that. It's a sort of theory, not only a theory about morality, but also a theory about human nature that has important suggestions for ethics and for ethical theory and for ethical theorizing. However, do not have anything as straightforward as an approach as we've discussed in the big three approaches so far. So part of the reason why we're covering existentialism is because existentialism is slightly more challenging than the already existing moral theories that we have discussed. But there are actually all sorts of non-traditional ethical theories. When I teach a higher level course at UNM about ethical theory, we discuss, for example, Buddhism as having an ethical theory that doesn't quite fit in with any of the traditional ways of ethical consideration. However, has, a rigorous and thought through analysis and theory about what it means for something to be good or bad. So even though it doesn't resemble any of the ethical theories that we, perhaps know or work with in the West, it's an ethical theory nevertheless. If we had more time in this class, I would love to spend more time discussing more non-canonical, non-Western ethical theories. But another aspect of the reading for this week is that it is considerably more difficult than the readings that you've had so far. The readings that we've covered so far in the class were primarily secondary works, so contemporary philosophers writing now defending one or more ethical theories and explaining them. However, in reading the Sartre itself, we are getting to the source, right? We're examining a primary source text. This is the origins of a way of thinking about ethics. And so it's going to be considerably more difficult than a contemporary interpreter figuring things out for us. So make sure that you give yourself enough time this week to complete the reading and, to note the increased difficulty level. Now, I've mentioned that existentialism is a non-traditional ethical theory, but what does existentialism actually say? Sartre is interesting because he's one of the only philosophers that actually gives like a positive definition to the word existentialism and is willing to endorse it. According to Sartre, as we have written up here on the board, existentialism can be defined by the thesis that in human beings, existence precedes essence. So to get the sense for what Sartre is saying, consider a kind of religious perspective on the world. You might think that there is, for example, a God, and this God arranged the world, and in fact, this God also arranged the world such that you can fulfill a purpose within the world. And if that were true, then in a way, you would have a sort of vocation, right? It'd be a vocation given to you by God. There was something with your life that you were meant to do. And, then you go out and you fulfill your vocation, or you fail to do so. But in a way, the religious viewpoint sees this as preordained, right? There's a divine cosmic plan and that is, initiated by a sort of divine being. And your role is to find your place within that plan. Sartre would describe that as you having a kind of essence. Your essence, the thing that you essentially are is the vocation given to you by God. And we can understand this by analogy, right? We create artifacts like chairs and tables and laptops and cameras and lights and so on, right? And we do so in order to fulfill a purpose. You lose the essence of a fork, right? If you modify the shape too much, right? It has a purpose, it has an essence, it has a vocation that is meant to fulfill. And if you modify it in the right ways, then it will no longer fulfill that vocation. So what existentialism is saying is the opposite of that. That it's not that we have an essence or we have some sort of vocation, we have a place in the world or a divine plan, and then we have to go out and fulfill that vocation. Instead, we exist, right? There's the sheer fact of our existence, and only afterwards do we then determine what our essence is, right? Who we really are and what really matters. So in other words, part of what Sartre is trying to say is that there is no God, or if there is, then it doesn't matter. This is the existentialist view on God. To begin with sort of the latter perspective, Christian existentialists like Kierkegaard would ask the question, well, okay, if there is such a thing as what we're calling this divine vocation, then how is it that I could ever come to know my role within it, right? Should I get married? Should I not get married? Should I accept this job? Should I not accept this job? From Kierkegaard's point of view, even though he's Christian and very faithful, there's no way that we can know from the world what it is that we're meant to do. We're, in a way, abandoned, thrown out into the world without an understanding of our purpose or what it is that we are meant to accomplish. Sartre, in a way, goes one step further. He's an atheist philosopher, so he doesn't even believe in the existence of God. And moreover, he agrees with the also existentialist, atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche that God is dead, right? And so, in other words, this idea of someone who creates the world and creates a purpose or a role or a vocation for you is something that is considered to have less and less importance in secular society. So, if your life isn't divinely ordained, then it means that you have to decide on the meaning of your life yourself. You can't get any answers from God or a fortune teller or an astrologer or any other source. And because you're free, you are accordingly responsible for what it is that you are. If there is a God and there were something like a divine plan, and you had simply a role to fulfill within that plan, then it would be very feasible and coherent for you to think something like, well, all of this was decided without me. God made a plan for the world before I was born, and I just fit myself in it. And so I'm not really responsible for anything that happens in the world. I'm simply doing my part of a plan that I didn't choose. Existentialism exactly rejects this idea. Existentialism always maintains that you are responsible for what you are. You're not how you fit into any kind of divine plan or cosmic perspective. Instead, you are, in a way, the perspective that you have on yourself. Another way that Sartre puts this is that you are condemned to be free. In other words, you can't choose not to be free. And therefore, you're always responsible, liable, culpable for what it is that you are. And so I have two quotes here. I don't know why the camera seems not focused, but hopefully things will change. In any case, I will just simply read out the quote. The first quote that we have here says, quote, "Man is, before all else, something that projects itself into the future and is conscious of doing so." So what we are fundamentally are projects, right? The project of being who we are. So I think Sartre would say that my most foundational project would be something like being myself, being Penny, right? And then I could think about that existential or fundamental project of my life as consisting in a lot of different projects. I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm an aunt, right? I'm a teacher. All of these things factor into being the person that I am. And it's not anything like a destiny, which would be something like past-oriented, that defines who I am, but it's instead how I conceive of myself and what I will work towards achieving that defines who I am. So in other words, my existence is future-oriented rather than determined by the nature of the past. This means that man is responsible for what he is. This is on page 23. So Sartre describes that we all have kind of like a fundamental anguish that resides in the human condition. We all, in a way, are born into a world that we didn't choose or understand, and now we have the absurd and, in a way, impossible task of figuring out who and what we are and what it is that we value. Sometimes people think things like that if there weren't this sort of idea of a cosmic plan or a divine ordinance or something like that, that there would be no point in morality. The morality would be, in a way, fake, a sham, something that we just make up, right? And some existentialist philosophers do kind of think this way. Friedrich Nietzsche kind of thinks this way. Dostoevsky, who is a literary author, novelist, but also sort of like existential philosopher that we're going to read later on, says if there is no God, then everything is permitted, right? Morality has no basis anymore on this interpretation. But what Sartre endeavors to show in the Existentialism is a Humanism lecture is exactly that that inference is false. That in a way, revealing our existential situation, highlighting the importance of existentialist philosophy, will, if anything, make us realize the even greater importance of ethics and morality than we realized previously. So on this lower half of the board, I've just chosen to emphasize a few themes that are brought out in Sartre's philosophy. Of course, our treatment here cannot be exhaustive in any respect, right? But we should touch on some of these ideas. The first one is abandonment, right? And here you have this line that I said about God being dead, or that he may as well be. One thing that I wanted to emphasize is that there are many ways that we try to secularize God, right? So we become more and more secular as a society, less and less religious, but we continue to hold on to religious concepts. We just transform them so that they aren't as explicitly religious. So, even though we don't believe in something like God, right, or at least that's how Sartre describes his contemporaries in the 20th century, nevertheless, everyone continues to believe in the existence of something like human nature. They can tell us what it is that we should really be doing. Our belief in the ability of science, for example, to tell us like what kinds of social behaviors are healthy, what kinds of social behaviors are unhealthy, right? We want someone to make a decision about the things that are good or bad, like Christians wanted a judge, right? Someone who could be the lawbringer of the world and rule over it. Sartre's idea about abandonment is not only that there's no God on his view, but also more fundamentally that there are no signs in the world, right? And what he means by that is nothing in the world can simply tell you how it is that you should behave. So when we turn to advice from someone else, right, there's no one who can guarantee that we're making the right decision. Any person we choose to go to advise, we're choosing to trust them, right? So there's no infallible guide for what it is that you should do in any kind of situation. And this is the fundamental anguish of the human position, right? That we're free beings, and we would desperately like to avoid the implications of that freedom, namely the immense responsibility that it has on us. So we try to look for signs or interpretations in the world that can tell us what it is that we should do. Like, my astrology app or whatever told me I should behave this way, so I'm going to do it, right? Any sort of mystical behavior in this way is, according to Sartre's view, like a kind of bad faith, right? It's a way of trying to avoid our fundamental situation. The next terminology that I have here is situation, and I've written here that we are thrown into the world that we did not choose. Our bodies, our histories, our past, right? We didn't select our bodies. We didn't decide where it is that we're going to be born, and we didn't decide either about the facts of human history. So existentialists often say, obviously they're thinking about the early 20th century, so, world on the brink, right? Brink of war and destruction. They were thrown into a violent and difficult, conflicted world, right? And we don't have the ability to simply will that it was different than it is, right? It's an ineliminable fact about our situation. Now, turning to the other side here, the last two key words I have written here are project and responsibility. So in terms of project, I want you to think about project, like projection or a projectile, right? Going outward, to break outward. Sartre defines us as a project because whatever our situation is, we have to decide how it is that we're going to use that situation to become who it is that we are, right? We are always more than the sum total of our situation. We are what we make of our situation, right? How it is that we understand and internalize our situation and make it part of our identity. Our situation is in a certain way absurd, right? We didn't choose the confines of our freedom, right? We didn't choose the context in which we were born, but we can nevertheless choose what that context means for us. And so for Sartre, this has an important moral lesson, right? Namely, one about the nature of moral responsibilities. Because it's not like we just have free-floating projects. Instead, values underlie our projects. When we choose who we are, we choose what we stand by. And Sartre says, for example, quote, "And in choosing myself, I choose man." Sartre's thought goes like this, that when I decide to be myself, when I decide to be Penelope, I'm committing myself to a certain set of values, and obviously living out those values in a particular kind of way. So think about how I choose to be a teacher, for example. This comes with a certain set of values. Right? It doesn't really make sense to be a teacher if you don't value critical inquiry, if you don't value reflection, if you don't value the ability to be free, right? To reflect on your decision making and decide for yourself who it is that you want to be. So being a teacher is in a way being committed to, not only the freedom of my students, but I have a generalized commitment to freedom for everybody, right? So of course I have special obligations to my own students, but part of what is invoked in my decision to be a teacher is the belief that everyone should have the capacity to learn philosophy if they so choose. I think that that's an important part of being a free person, and getting an education in this way, we very often think of as central to civic life. And so it's not as if I could just decide, well, my project is to be a teacher, so I'm just going to look out for myself and I'm not going to care about anybody else, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because when I'm choosing for myself to be a teacher, I'm choosing for a world where there are schools and where there are students and where there is a productive relationship between teachers and students, right? And so my project is in a way tied up with the projects of everyone else, right? If students are being harmed or unable to accomplish their schoolwork, then that must fundamentally concern me as a teacher, because my project is bound up with the projects of my students. In the same way that my project to be a wife is bound up with my wife's project, my project of being a daughter is bound up with my mother's project of being a mother, and so on. And so all of our freedoms, even though apparently individual and particular to each of us, cohere together. And Sartre thought that this formed a necessity for us to see our freedoms as fundamentally interconnected with one another. And he thought that existentialism, far from sort of resulting in the situation of screw you, I got mine, can instead show us what's at stake and what it is that we owe each other, which is ultimately, for Sartre, everything. I hope that you found this video interesting. I look forward to hearing what you think, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.